In Vaush's debate with Count Dankula over whether or not Dankula was a white supremacist, the point was made that talking about things like policy or opinions with a white supremacist was pointless because they would just lie. And so, Vaush, starting from the position that Dankula was a hidden white supremacist, a crypto-supremacist if you will, didn't actually want to ask relevant questions, but simply say shit like, you told a racist joke, therefore you're a racist.
I made racist jokes in the past, doesn't mean that I'm racist. They're just jokes.
Right. So I want to open up. Oh, sorry.
I've got a way to sort of do this right now. You feel that there's certain beliefs that obviously that white supremacists have, correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, they'd have to.
Well, why not ask me if I believe in those things?
Oh,
That's
sure.
Yeah,
the answer is because I think you guys lie because you're spineless cowards. That's the main reason why.
This is something Vaush would repeat in his conversation with Lilith. Only now Dankula's graduated from white supremacist to fascist.
Do you have people like Count Dankula, for example, who, like, when he makes comments that, like, seem openly fash, it's always like a joke, and he can walk it back. But his audience loves those comments. They're not joking. They like it, you know. But he's joking. Wink. Well, I mean, me personally, I think he's a fascist, or he's not ideologically consistent enough to know that he is. But from what I've seen, that seems to be like the underlying political message that he's pushed.
And hey, I'm thrown in there as well.
I know Short Fat Otaku does this to some extent as well, and there are other prominent libertarians who I think kind of play cover a lot, you know?
I mean, I'm not even conservative, Republican, or a libertarian. If you watch enough of Vaush's content, you see this sort of thing repeated over and over, to the point that he now believes that all conservatives, all Republicans, all libertarians, and pretty much almost everybody who is to the right of him are fascists.
If you have a conservative family member, I'm sorry, they're part of the problem. If you have a conservative friend, I'm sorry, they're part of the problem. And every conservative, every Republican is on the hook for this. Every last one of them. People will be treating MAGA material the exact same way we treat Holocaust or World War II or Wehrmacht or SS materials today.
At some point, Vaush has also said something to the effect of, fascism isn't a coherent political ideology. It's simply a naked power grab that adopts the rhetoric of other philosophies as a means to an end, while not actually implementing the goals of those philosophies. And no, I don't have a clip for this one. You can only watch so much brain rot at once. But his video about social fascism contains a bit that has a lot of the same spirit.
Fascism is a disease. It's a creeping mold that spreads from person to person using ideas like nationalism and racism as vectors. And every once in a while you get you want to call it a super spreader like QAnon. You get these wacky ideas and you can spread to many people very quickly, but it always requires a bad idea and it spreads.
Vaush's guiding thesis here is that fascism is subversive, that it's incoherent, it has no real political philosophy, so it lies about everything in its attempt to overthrow liberal democracy. And Vaush is correct, but he's correct for the wrong reasons. Consider the claim that fascism has no real canon. It's not just Vaush, this is a common belief among socialists. Look online wherever this sort of discussion is happening. You'll hear about subversive fascists co-opting socialist language, or how fascism is inherently contradictory. Some of the socialists I've talked to on this channel have said that as well.
Fascism is kind of like very incoherent in its philosophy. A lot of it is like complete nonsense.
The problem is, it isn't really true, but I can tell you at least one of the reasons why they think that. Wikipedia. Yeah, I've had this passage quoted to me by commies more times than I can count. This is from Giovanni Gentile's Wikipedia page, the philosopher of fascism. With Gentile and with fascism, the problem of the party existed by virtue of the fact that the fascist party arose organically rather than from a tract or pre-established socio-political doctrine. This complicated the matter for Gentile as it left no consensus to any way of thinking among the fascists. But ironically, this aspect was to Gentile's view of how a state or party doctrine should live out its existence, with natural organic growth and dialectical opposition intact. Dialectical opposition there referencing Hegel's thesis, antithesis, synthesis method. Gentile, like Marx, was a neo-Hegelian philosopher. This objection seems to stem from the observation, as well as Gentile's own acceptance of that observation, that fascism arose organically without a guiding philosophy, rather than a philosophy first being written and then a social movement following it. A Marxist critique of fascism is that this lack of a philosophical basis leads to a fundamental irrationality within fascist movements, creating a vacuum that almost inevitably boils down to raw power as justification for their existence. And you have to admit, there is something to this view, but again, it's not the whole story. Socialists commonly regurgitate their misreading of the Wikipedia passage in order to win Twitter debates, but none of them will actually read the whole article as being quoted, presumably because none of them have a login to JSTOR. I still do, though. To be honest, I thought it would have been cancelled by now. I've been at school for like 8 years. The truth is, the reference text is literally called The Problem of the Party in Italian Fascism, published in the Journal of Contemporary History, Volume 9, Number 2, April of 1984, by Emilio Gentile. No relation to Giovanni Gentile, by the way. It's a funny coincidence that Italy's philosopher of fascism as a political movement, as well as Italy's foremost scholar of fascism from a historic context, both happen to share the same family name. But Emilio is a liberal and there really is no political or genetic connection. In the article, Emilio Gentile writes, "The Fascist Party was in no sense a homogeneous organism, not only because of the inevitable mutations to which all parties are subject, but also because within the structure and functions of the party, there were a number of clearly distinct attitudes and modes of operation. During its history, the Fascist Party underwent a real metamorphosis, which substantially modified its original characteristics, without, however, completely wiping out the typical features by which its historical identity can be recognized, in spite of the structural and functional changes. It would, however, be superficial to attribute these changes only to circumstance, unpremeditated interventions, class interests, and power plays. These changes, in fact, correspond to a logic, which we might define as specifically totalitarian, consistent with the conception of mass politics characteristic of fascism." In other words, while the socialists are correct in describing fascism as growing organically, and therefore that method might seem outwardly contradictory, and therefore subversive, the socialists are entirely incorrect when they assert that nothing exists below the surface of fascism. No, there is certainly a coherent logic. It is certainly a thing that can be concretely identified, not simply a vague, creeping rot, as Vaush described it. And if these brainlets ever actually did any reading, they'd know that. It's actually kind of incredible. If you point out that you've read Mein Kampf, or Mussolini's Doctrine of Fascism, or Alfredo Rocco's Political Doctrine of Fascism, every socialist will scream at you that you're a crypto-fascist. If you reply with the obvious response, that you're reading about fascism not because you're a fascist, but to learn about fascism, the socialists will tell you not to bother, because fascist theory is inherently contradictory, and fascists all lie about what they believe. Oh, also, that large swaths of the population are fascist even when they're not, even if they're bad in some other non-fascist way.
Fascism is authoritarianism and conservatism mixed together. That's what fascism is. I don't need this Umberto Eco's fucking take on it.
These same people, if you happen to have some misconceptions about socialism or communism or anarchism, they'll demand that you read Marx or Kropotkin or Proudhon, and they will happily, love-bombingly direct you towards any sources you require, because unlike fascist theorists, their guys aren't incoherent, their guys wouldn't lie. Yeah. When somebody tells you to accept their propaganda unthinkingly, but don't you dare read that other guy's heretical works or else you're pure evil, who's being the subversive now? Personally, I would just tell you to read everything. Read it with a critical eye, but read it nonetheless. That being said, what the socialists see as irrationality within fascism, the fascists describe themselves as pragmatism. In Rocco's Political Doctrine of Fascism, he states, "Fascism solves the eternal problem of economic freedom and of state interference, considering both as mere methods, which may or may not be employed in accordance with the social needs of the moment, and that fascists differ fundamentally from the liberals. The latter see in liberty a principle, the fascists accept it as a method. By the liberals, freedom is granted in the interest of the citizens, the fascists grant it in the interest of society. The point here isn't that fascism is contradictory, it's that fascism is a consequentialist ideology, happy to use the methods of other political ideologies if the end result is good for fascism." Of course, considering that a lot of socialists are die-hard consequentialists, it's no wonder they prefer that you not read about this stuff. There are also other theorists and other books they prefer you not read about as well. Zeev Sternhell, a Polish-born Jew who survived the Holocaust to become a historian and academic on the topic of fascism, was the first to recognize that fascism was socialist tactics wearing a nationalist uniform. Sargon did a premium Lotus Eaters video on one of his history texts, a video I bullied him for months to make, and if you have premium there, it's worth a watch. Sternhell also identified George Sorel, or Georges, I can't pronounce French names, guys, as the missing evolutionary link between Marxism and fascism. Sorel was a syndicalist who, after observing that the proletariat did not actually rise up in revolt when called upon to fight the First World War, declared Marxism a failure. Sorel discovered that the proletariat is always the most reactionary force in any society, and considered Marx to be incorrect about the revolutionary potential. Sorel also correctly recognized that the proletariat are often driven to act when they believe in a collective mythos, whether that be the state, or the people, or the religion. Sorel spent much of his life advocating for socialism achieved through his conception of national syndicalism, and both Mussolini and Lenin are considered equal successors to Sorelian thought, for doing what Sorel described as the union of the national and the social. something I have studied without ever developing the idea. Sorel's philosophy, acting as the bridge between Marxism and fascism, is more extensively explored in James Meisel's article, A Premature Fascist, published in the Western Political Quarterly, Volume 3, Number 1, March 1950. And we will absolutely return to Sorel's philosophy in a future video, because there is some interesting stuff in there. Another common bit of nonsense is that fascism is somehow capitalism in decay, and that late-stage capitalism is simply another step along this inevitable march.
It should be pointed out that it's no surprise that a proud ethno-nationalist would endorse an economic system whose final form is fascism. After all, the dictatorial regimes of Franco, Mussolini, and Hitler all followed a set pattern, an authoritarian salvation of the capitalist system resulting in their oversight over its industries.
The issue with this view is, again, a lack of knowledge on the part of the socialists. If you were to actually question a breadtuber about this, and get a real answer rather than snark and toxicity, they would probably say either one of two things. One, that the word privatization was literally invented to describe fascist economics, and it wasn't. Or two, they would pull out this Mussolini quote: "Fascism should more appropriately be called corporatism, because it is a merger of state and corporate power." And this is where the breadtuber stops reading, secure in their knowledge that corporations are fascist, and therefore they're bad. But alas, it is not so simple. Here is how things read when you don't simply stop as soon as your preconceived biases are confirmed. The corporate state considers that private enterprise in the sphere of production is the most effective and useful instrument in the interest of the nation. In view of the fact that private organization of production is a function of national concern, the organizer of the enterprise is responsible to the state for the direction given to production. Giovanni Gentile's philosophy contained multiple Hegelian innovations to the socialism of old. He believed that publicness and privateness would cease to exist within a fascist system, synthesized into a state of incorporation where everything, all people, and all property became organs of the state, in line with Hegel's view that the state is the highest embodiment of the divine idea on earth. Back in A Premature Fascist, Meisel states, fascism, while preserving the framework of capitalism and tolerating the entrepreneurs and financiers as individuals, was destroying their power as a class. The fascist answer to the class struggle was not a revolt by the proletariat against the bourgeoisie that would seize the means of production and make them community-owned, as Marx described. It was the incorporation of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie and the means of production into the state, as the state was the ideal vessel for the community. Most importantly of all, though, none of this nonsense is liberal economics. In fact, this idea of incorporation, which can rightfully be called fascist economics, bears no relation to liberalism at all, and is in fact nearly identical to what the breadtubers derisively call state capitalism. The Soviet Union, China, Cuba, Venezuela, derisively, even as they support them nonetheless. This is why you hear such sayings as fascism is honest socialism, even though that's not fully accurate. It's more like fascism is post-Marxist socialism. Here's the biggest kicker, though. These idiots don't actually believe that fascism is capitalism in decay. If they did, surely they'd be accelerationists, right? If centrism truly enabled fascism, if liberalism inevitably decayed into fascism, which inevitably collapsed into socialism, if Marx was right about it all and Gentile was not, wouldn't you want this process to continue? At least the socialists of old had the good sense to be consistent and call social democracy social fascism for its part in helping the working class while preventing a revolution. Oh wait, Vaush thinks that's true too.
There were a number of left-wing political parties which basically took their orders directly from the Kremlin in the 1920s and 1930s, which adopted the mantra of, or at least the idea that this thing exists, this thing called social fascism. And the argument was that fascism, that is one thing, and then you have another thing, and that other thing is social fascism. And social fascism is everything that isn't fascism or socialism, essentially. Social fascism, so named because it procures the social conditions which lead to fascism. And there is a crumb of truth in here as well. Take liberalism, for example. Does liberalism lead to fascism? Well, yeah.
And with that Vaush clip, we come to the apex of this discussion. Fascism is subversive, but not because it's incoherent. The idea that fascism has no guiding doctrine is itself a Marxist subversion, designed to hide the fact that fascism is a post-Marxist socialism, and that fascism versus socialism, Marx versus Gentile, is not a battle between two ends of an ideological dipole, but instead a civil war between two factions, both aiming to inherit Hegel's anti-liberal crown. Fascism is subversive because socialism is subversive. And this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. We've all seen this subterfuge. That's not real communism, or not real socialism, is heard all over the place. Not because it's a true statement, it's always real socialism. but because it never does what they want it to do, so they don't count it. But that's just surface level stuff. Consider how often that socialist environmentalists object to non-socialist environmental plans, because those plans do not also implement socialism and dismantle capitalism while solving the climate crisis.
Climate change is a problem about equity. It's a problem about race. It's a problem about how we relate to one another. And so I think this climate crisis actually might provide us with an opportunity in a weird way.
Consider the mass subversion of cultural institutions by people with explicitly Marxist agendas, under the guise of everything being political and neutrality being a bourgeois privilege. In fact, to the point that subversion is often literally a stated goal by the wokest of the woke. Consider the account of Yuri Bezmenov, a former KGB agent whose career revolved around a form of subversion the Soviets called active measures, where cultural and academic institutions would be infiltrated and seeded with Marxism. And consider this. Back at the start of this video, Vaush asserted that you cannot truly know who a fascist is, because they'll never tell you. You have to intuit it through things like his humor. At this point in the video, have you managed to figure out exactly what is wrong with Vaush's view of things? In 1921, Ferruccio Ganiglia, an Italian Marxist, was killed by one of Mussolini's fascist black shirts by a gunshot to the head. There was a public outcry against political violence within a liberal state, where voting and debate should take the place of beatings and killings. But the black shirts didn't care. In 1922, Giacomo Matteotti, the leader of the Italian Unitary Socialist Party, decried Mussolini's election as fraudulent. He was kidnapped by the black shirts, thrown into the trunk of a car, stabbed to death, and dumped in the woods. Again, there's a public outcry, but the black shirts didn't care. In July of 1925, Giovanni Amendola, the leader of the Italian Democratic Liberal Party, an outspoken critic of Mussolini, had the absolute shit beat out of him by 15 black shirts with clubs, and suffered a long, slow death over the next 9 months. Mussolini did not play word games with these events. He didn't dog whistle, he didn't virtue signal. He openly stated in Parliament that the black shirts were his, that he wanted these men dead, and that he did not care about what others thought about it. And for his efforts, Mussolini was made dictator for life, and the people, for a time, were bent to his will. Does this sound like a man who is lying, who will never ever tell you that he is a fascist? Or does this sound like a man who is open and brazen about it, and who is hoping that the average liberal or the politically unaligned citizen will be desensitized to his violence? Someone like you. Because, though subversion is a tool in the fascist handbook, it's not a requirement. The fascist doesn't even need to make you a fascist. He just needs to get you to accept his violence as normal, without protesting. At some point in time, Vaush has also stated that any socialist will simply tell you they're a socialist, that socialists are open and honest about their politics. Again, I can't re-find this clip, but he says it often enough that I don't think he would object. And yet you can find clips of people who are absolutely socialists refusing to even countenance the question.
There's a point I really have to put to you, and you'll be aware of this, because there's been a lot of commentary about this in the British media, about you. You've been a member of the Communist Party for about 40 years now. You're still a member. And we know that communism is basically statist. We look at communist countries around the world and we see that they are tremendously top-down dominant and controlled societies that they rule over. And I just wonder, and I'm putting this question on behalf of those who wonder about your politics, if your politics actually informs your sense of control. It's not just the medical argument, but you have a kind of a political bent to want the state to tell people what to do.
I've come on your programme as a scientist, as do all people who come onto your programme as scientists. They come on to talk about the evidence, relevant theories, how we approach our scientific disciplines, and you don't ask other scientists about politics. So I'm very happy to speak about science, which is what my job is, and to limit it to that.
So you're saying that your politics doesn't inform your opinion on this subject?
I'm saying that I agreed to come on this programme as a scientist, and I'm very happy to talk to you about the issues that you're raising as a scientist.
You can even find clips of Vaush describing how good it is to hide the fact that you're a socialist for tactical reasons.
If you want to come off like really cool when you're a socialist, you can just say you're an internationalist, and it means basically the same thing from a leftist perspective, but people won't look at you like you just said you're a Hillary Clinton supporter. Basically, if you're ever around Shoe on Head and you want to say that you support like cooperation amidst like economic and political systems the world around, okay, you say you're an internationalist, all right? You say you're an internationalist and you'll be fine.
It's not just public figures. there's also a specific type of boiling the frog in all socialist speech. I've had this exact same conversation with like a dozen online crypto socialists now. And the next time you see this, you should try it too. Maybe you're talking to a libertarian socialist or a democratic socialist, or maybe you're talking to somebody who outwardly identifies as a social democrat, but they're advocating quite strongly for one topic. Maybe it's universal healthcare, maybe it's universal worker co-ops, or blanket free college, or something like that. And inevitably, if you ask them about what their politics looks like after they've implemented this thing they're talking about, they'll almost always say something like, well, that's a good first step. But then you gotta ask, what's the second step? What's the third step? Where's the point when you say, okay, here is good? There's no reason to go any further than this. This example on screen right now is one of many who advocate for something small and unassuming, but his next steps are a stateless, moneyless, classless society, making him not a sock dem or a socialist, but a communist. And in fact, when I point this out in our conversation, he suddenly becomes a lot less friendly. Your politics are not what you advocate for right now, but what your ideal end state is after all of the right nows have been accomplished. This is why, for example, when Shuon Head said, I'm not a socialist because I like socialism but it's not feasible right now, she's actually a socialist. And maybe it's just me and my sensibilities, but hiding your power level like that seems subversive as fuck. And speaking of hiding your power level, Vaush calls himself a market socialist. Basically, they're still trading with money, but your whole economy is worker co-ops. But do you actually think he is a market socialist? Let's hear it from his own mouth.
In your mind, is market socialism temporary or permanent? Oh, temporary. Look, okay, so here's the issue, okay? Are you ready for it? Okay. Let's say Shittopia goes socialist. Shittopia is right here. Right there. Shittopia goes socialist, okay? It's right there, all right? Now here's the issue, okay? How do they go socialist? Well, they take the traditional route. So what they do is the workers have an uprising, they seize control of the state, then after seizing control of the state, they kick out all foreign investors, all foreign businesses, they nationalize the industry in their country, and they start producing everything for the people by the people, okay? Congratulations, we've done it. Now here's the issue with that, all right? Shittopia has made a critical error, okay? Shittopia is no longer a market society, meaning that the goods which are produced within the borders of this country are not produced for the purpose of selling others. Now, that's great in concept. Decommodification's good. But here's the issue. I'm going to paint in black every country that's going to trade with them now. Wait, that's not going to trade with them. Okay. The issue is that with the abolition of a market society, you no longer have an ability to meaningfully trade with neighboring nations. And if you can't do that, not only does your country suffer, because there's a lot of shit you can't produce just in your own country, it also means every other country on Earth has absolutely no reason to not just go in there and fucking annihilate you, okay? Why the fuck? If you're completely cut off from the markets of the world, why the fuck what incentive is there for any other country in the world to tolerate your existence? From their perspective, all the resources in your country are just locked off to the universe. The reason why I like market socialism is because it means you can bide your time and wait for other countries to start popping up that are also worker controlled. And once those countries start popping up, you can form trade blocs, which is pivotal because if you form trade blocs, you gain the ability to trade with first world nations, and in doing so, you disincentivize military action against your countries. The United States stands to lose a tremendous amount of wealth, resources, labor, what have you, from the collective trade bloc that you're invading as the US. There is a benefit to remaining a market society. Now, you only do this for long enough that it's necessary. Eventually, if enough of the world ends up being socialist, once there are enough countries working together, it's now possible for them to represent enough of an economic and military bloc that the rest of the countries in the world don't really have a way of meaningfully opposing them. The real goal is to make capitalist countries dependent on market socialist countries.
In the end, Vaush is not actually a market socialist. His ideal end state is literally talking about Soviet-style top-down command economies, but only after market socialism has managed to subvert enough of the world that it becomes the dominant power bloc, and then is able to impose its will on the rest of the planet, whether they want it or not. By the way, Vaush, What country is currently implementing your exact plan, anyway?
Can you imagine, by the way, what would happen if America went to war with China and we didn't get any more Chinese goods in this country? This country would fucking collapse, okay? We don't need nukes to destroy America. All we need to do is cut off trade from China, all right? This country would be fucking done. Everything we rely on, bye-bye, and whoever started that war is not getting reelected next election, okay? If you are sufficiently economically powerful, you're just not going to, the war is not going to happen. Because in democracies, there is a threat that comes along with depriving your population of material comfort. So the goal in market socialism is to preserve your relation to those economic transactions long enough that you can provide a sufficient deterrent against military action against you. It also means you don't hurt your own population because, whether you guys like it or not, being a market economy is way the fuck more fruitful than being a command economy right now in this era. Like, factually. The reason why Vietnam's GDP rose was because of market reform. Isn't this what China's doing? Well, China's not socialist, so it kind of defeats the purpose a little bit.
Yeah, so it turns out, Vaush's plan is literally the plan of Deng Xiaoping, and he's too dishonest to admit it, because socialism is always subversive, and BreadTube is never honest. In this video, I have described to you how fascism is a revolutionary philosophy, seeking to remake and incorporate society, and how liberals and conservatives, not socialists, are most likely to oppose it. I have described to you how fascism is subversive, sometimes by hiding their power levels, but more often than not through desensitizing their opponents to political terror by constantly performing brazen acts of street violence. I have described to you how fascism despises liberalism, using its own institutions to destroy it from within. I have described to you how fascism has a totalitarian ideology that must incorporate everything into its structures, and violently destroy anything that cannot be incorporated. And most importantly of all, I have shown you how each of these points that apply to fascism apply to socialism in equal measure, from their revolutionary ideals, to their brazen political violence, to their hatred of liberals and liberal institutions, and to their totalizing nature. We will dig into the political theory of Marx and Gentile, the feuding brothers, in a future video. But for now, remember this. It's very easy to find a friendly socialist. They're often young, idealistic, maybe a little dumb sometimes, but almost always good-natured and looking to do what they think will make things better. And even though they won't actually make things better, don't blame them. When all you read is Marx, how can you know any better? But it's not so for their talking heads. Every point that every breadtuber makes about fascism can just as easily be applied to themselves. Their hatred of ideological difference, their revolutionary rhetoric, their lies and their bad faith, their support of political violence as praxis, just as on the other side of their mouth they decry political violence if done by their enemies, and their constant, overwhelming, deafening refrain about how, despite what our lion eyes see, they totally seriously hate the tankies guys. The reality is, all forms of socialism, from Marxism to fascism to everything in between, are all the moral equivalents of each other, and as liberals, our only option is to oppose them. Thank you for watching, my friends. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to share it around and do all of the other algorithm positive stuff that the YouTube engagement metrics like. I don't know. Sub for more, or hit up my Patreon or Subscribestar if you want to keep it coming. And be sure to stick around, because I'm putting up a new video every single day. So, I'll see you tomorrow. I love you.